The hum of the courtroom echoed like a swarm of restless bees, a constant buzz reflecting the tension saturating the air. Every corner of the chamber was packed. Victims, journalists, lawyers, and onlookers crowded the wooden benches, shoulder to shoulder, as if no one wanted to miss the spectacle of the century. Conversations mingled with nervous murmurs, whispers charged with indignation, curiosity, and a touch of morbid fascination. Everyone awaited the same moment, when Ethan Grayson, the man whose arrogance and greed had shattered so many lives, would finally face justice. Not a subscriber yet? Join our community by clicking subscribe and turning on the notification bell to get notified every time we upload a new video. Then, the courtroom doors creaked open. The noise ceased as if by magic, and all eyes turned toward him. Ethan Grayson entered the room as if he were hosting a gala, not standing trial on multiple counts of fraud. His tall, commanding figure exuded confidence. He wore a dark grey designer suit, so pristine it looked like it had just come off a showroom mannequin. His hair, slicked back meticulously, glinted under the lights, and a faint, disdainful smile adorned his face. Ethan didn't walk to his seat, he strutted. Each step echoed on the marble floor, reinforcing his air of superiority. He didn't look directly at anyone, but his presence dominated the room. To him, this was merely another minor obstacle, another opportunity to showcase his supposed mastery over any situation. From his perspective, this courtroom was filled with lesser beings, mere spectators in a drama where he remained the star. In the front row, Angela Martinez clutched her youngest daughter Sophia's hand tightly. Her eyes were locked on Ethan, filled with a mix of hatred and despair. Angela, a widowed mother of 3, had lost everything: her home, her savings, her dreams of a secure future for her family. Sophia had been forced to drop out of college, and now the entire family lived in a cramped rental apartment they could barely afford. Each glance Angela cast at Ethan was a painful reminder of the empty promises he had made, promises that had pushed her family to the brink of ruin. Beside her, Peter Vaughn, a retired firefighter, sat with his arms crossed, his jaw clenched, teeth grinding. After 35 years battling flames, he had saved enough for a dignified retirement, but now he lived on his younger brother's couch, his dignity and independence reduced to ashes by Ethan's lies. He stared at the defendant with an intensity that seemed capable of piercing the designer suit and reaching the heart, if Ethan had one. But if the victim's gazes were daggers, Judge Monica Lee's was a hammer. When she entered the courtroom, the entire room rose to its feet, everyone except Ethan. While the others obeyed the bailiff's command, Ethan remained seated, leafing casually through a notebook as if uninterested in the court's formalities. Judge Lee paused as she reached the bench. She said nothing at first, but her gaze fell on Ethan like an impending storm. She didn't need to raise her voice or make a gesture. Her presence, calm yet formidable, spoke for itself. She was known for her unwavering commitment to justice, a judge who wouldn't be intimidated by wealth or power. In that moment, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Everyone in the courtroom could feel it. Something was about to happen. "You may be seated," the judge finally said, her voice firm but controlled. Ethan glanced up briefly, offering a mocking smile before returning to his notebook. His contempt was palpable, a deliberate act of defiance that seemed to say, "This doesn't touch me." The murmurs in the room grew louder. It was unheard of, unthinkable, for someone to challenge Judge Lee in such a manner. But Ethan was no ordinary man. He was the person who had defied rules for years, amassing wealth and power at the expense of others. To him, these people were insignificant, mere pawns in a game he believed he controlled completely. What Ethan Grayson didn't realize was that this day marked the beginning of the end. His arrogant smile, his disdain for the victims, and his belief that money could buy everything were about to collide with an undeniable truth. Justice may be slow, but it always arrives. Ethan's downfall had begun. Though he seemed blissfully unaware, Judge Monica Lee, with the composure of someone who had seen far too many cases of unchecked arrogance, took her seat at the bench. She adjusted her glasses as she reviewed the documents before her, her movements calm and methodical. But beneath her serene exterior, her mind was already dissecting every detail of the case. This wasn't just another trial. It was a symbol, a message to those who believed money and power rendered them untouchable. Click subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you'll stay updated on our upcoming videos and won't miss a thing. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced, and the murmurs in the room instantly ceased. All eyes were on Ethan, waiting for some reaction, some flicker of acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. But all they saw was a nonchalant gesture as he leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something that seemed more like a joke than a legal strategy. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor, rose, adjusting his jacket before addressing the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution will present compelling evidence that the defendant, Mr. Ethan Grayson, deliberately orchestrated a financial fraud scheme that devastated hundreds of families. This was not a mistake or a poor business decision. It was a calculated series of actions designed to enrich himself at the expense of others." As the prosecutor spoke, he gestured toward a projector displaying images of Ethan's mansions, yachts, and private jet. The opulence he had amassed seemed like a cruel mockery of the stories unfolding in the courtroom. In the front row, Angela Martinez watched intently, her dark eyes filled with pain and determination. Every word from the prosecutor was a reminder of the sleepless nights she had spent wondering how to feed her children after losing everything. Beside her, Peter Vaughn clenched his fists, the scars on his hands telling a tale of years of sacrifice and hard work, reduced to nothing by Ethan's empty promises. Ethan's defense attorney stood next, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. His voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to winning cases, even when the evidence was stacked against them. "Your Honor, this is not a case of deliberate fraud, but of an innovative businessman facing unforeseen market challenges. Mr. Grayson deeply regrets any harm caused, but the evidence will show that there was no criminal intent." Ethan crossed his legs, looking at the judge with an expression that seemed to say, "See, this is just a misunderstanding." But Monica Lee wasn't swayed. She could distinguish genuine remorse from a rehearsed act. And everything about Ethan, Grayson screamed of a man who had never known the meaning of regret. As the testimonies began, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The prosecutor called Angela Martinez to the stand. Her face displayed a mix of fear and strength as she walked toward the microphone. Before sitting, she pulled a handkerchief from her purse, as if anticipating the tears to come. "Ms. Martinez, can you tell us how you came to know Mr. Grayson?" the prosecutor asked in a calm tone. Angela took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she held the microphone. "I saw an ad on TV. They promised safe investments, a better future for our families. They spoke of dreams, and I believed them." Her voice cracked at the end, and several people in the room lowered their eyes, unable to bear the weight of her sorrow. Ethan, however, remained impassive. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something that brought a faint smile to the attorneys. "Un vase." Angela noticed this from the corner of her eye, pressing her lips together as she mustered the strength to continue. "I invested my entire life savings. My husband had passed away recently, and I thought this would help us move forward. But we lost everything. Our home, my children's future, everything." Her testimony struck a chord with everyone present. The prosecutor followed up by presenting evidence, illustrating how Ethan's promises had morphed into lies and how he had used the investments to fund a life of excess while victims like Angela were left destitute. Ethan's face remained stoic, his confidence unshaken. He seemed to view the entire proceeding as a show that would eventually work in his favor. What he didn't realize was that the show was just beginning, and this time he wasn't the one writing the script. The following days of the trial were an emotional whirlwind, with each testimony revealing more about the extent of Ethan Grayson's actions. But as the evidence mounted, one thing became increasingly clear. The defendant felt no remorse. On the fourth day of the trial, the prosecutor called Peter Vaughn to the stand. The grey-haired man, his posture upright despite the years, adjusted his tie before taking a seat. There was something solemn in his gaze, as if he carried not only his own story, but also the weight of everyone affected. "Mr. Vaughn," the prosecutor began, "you worked as a firefighter for more than 30 years, is that correct?" Peter nodded. "That's right. 35 years, to be exact. I worked to protect my community, to save lives. Can you tell us how you came to know Mr. Grayson and how you got involved in this scheme?" Peter took a deep breath before speaking. "I wanted to ensure that when I retired, I could live without depending on anyone. A friend told me about Grayson Investments, said it was a solid opportunity. So I invested everything I had. My pension, my fund, my savings. I even sold a property I'd inherited from my parents to invest more." The prosecutor stepped closer. "And what happened next?" Peter looked down, his hands balling into fists. "At first, it seemed legitimate. I received monthly reports. Everything looked fine. But then the calls stopped being answered. The reports stopped coming. When I finally got through to someone at the company, they told me the investment had been lost due to a market crisis." The prosecutor let the silence linger for a moment before asking, "And what impact did this have on your life, Mr. Vaughn?" Peter raised his head, his voice cracking slightly. "I lost my home. I had to move in with my brother because I couldn't afford rent. After spending my life helping others, now I'm the one who needs help. And that's what hurts the most." In the back, Ethan Grayson leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the table as though waiting for the day to end. But even those farthest from the stand could notice the brief furrow in his brow when Peter mentioned the market crisis. It was a fleeting moment, but enough for Judge Lee to take note. "Thank you, Mr. Vaughn," the prosecutor said before addressing the jury. "This man worked his entire life to build a dignified future, and in a matter of months, the defendant destroyed everything he had achieved. And he is not the only one." The prosecutor continued calling witnesses, each with their own story. Of devastation, a mother who had lost the money she had saved for her daughter's college education, a young entrepreneur whose store had closed after trusting Grayson's promises. Each testimony was another nail in the defendant's coffin. Ethan, however, remained unmoved. His attitude not only infuriated the victims, but also the jury and the public. During the testimony of an elderly woman who spoke of losing the savings she had accumulated with her late husband, Ethan let out a stifled laugh. The sound reverberated through the room like a dull thud, prompting murmurs and looks of disbelief. "Mr. Grayson," Judge Lee's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Is there something you'd like to share with this court?" Ethan looked up, his smile barely fading. "No, Your Honor, I just thought the performance was a bit dramatic." A murmur of indignation rippled through the room, but Judge Lee didn't raise her voice. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes fixed on him. "This is a court of justice, not a stage for your antics. I strongly suggest you conduct yourself appropriately, or I will be forced to take action." But Ethan didn't take the hint. His Arrogance would be his undoing. The following days turned into a spectacle both inside and outside the courtroom. The media, stationed outside, covered every detail with sensational headlines. The remorseless tycoon and Ethan Grayson, the face of modern greed, were just a few of the titles fueling national conversation. In the courtroom, Judge Lee maintained control, but it wasn't easy. Each day brought new challenges, especially due to Ethan Grayson's constant interruptions and disdainful behavior. His legal team struggled to shift the narrative, but the mountain of evidence and the chorus of testimonies made their job nearly impossible. A turning point came when the prosecution presented a crucial email sent directly by Ethan to his accounting team. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with a commanding voice, read it aloud. "We need to inflate these numbers. Don't worry about the details. Just make sure the investors buy the story. If anyone asks, come up with something believable." The silence in the room was so heavy that the creak of chairs as people leaned forward could be heard. Angela Martinez, seated in the front row, gripped her purse tightly, her eyes brimming with restrained tears. Peter Vaughn, beside her, shook, his head in a mix of disbelief and anger. "Mr. Grayson," the prosecutor began, approaching the stand with the printed email in hand. "Is this your email address?" Ethan smirked smugly. "Yes, but that doesn't mean anything. It's standard business language. Things get taken out of context all the time." The prosecutor took a step toward the jury, her gaze steady. "Taken out of context? Mr. Grayson, are you saying you didn't instruct your team to manipulate figures?" "Of course not," Ethan replied, leaning back in his chair with a theatrical display of boredom. "This is just business talk, something that, with all due respect, you don't seem to understand." A collective gasp escaped from the audience. The prosecutor, unfazed, turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, does this sound like the language of a man striving for transparency? Or the words of someone willing to do anything to line his pockets?" Judge Lee slammed her gavel. "Order in the court." She then directed a piercing look at Ethan. "Mr. Grayson, I have repeatedly warned you about your behavior in this courtroom. I suggest you do not test my patience again." The trial progressed with a steady stream of evidence, falsified documents, offshore accounts, and more incriminating emails. However, one of the most impactful moments came when a former employee of Grayson Investments, a man named Daniel Whitaker, took the stand. Daniel had worked as an analyst at the company, initially believing in the vision Ethan preached. However, he soon uncovered irregularities, and after years of carrying the guilt, decided to speak out. "Mr. Grayson knew exactly what he was doing," Daniel declared. "When I raised concerns about the legitimacy of some investments, he told me to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep collecting my paycheck." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his expression finally betraying a hint of unease. The prosecution seized on the shift. "Mr. Whitaker," the prosecutor continued, "could you describe the work environment at Grayson Investments under the defendant's leadership?" Daniel nodded. "It was toxic. Everything revolved around maintaining appearances, even if it meant lying or manipulating. Did you ever attempt to report these practices?" "Yes," Daniel replied, his voice trembling slightly. "I went to human resources, but it quickly became clear that everything was under his control. My report was ignored, and shortly after, I was terminated without explanation." The room was silent, the weight of Daniel's testimony pressing down on everyone present. For the first time, Ethan's confident facade showed cracks, but his arrogance had already sealed his fate. Help our channel grow. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated on our upcoming content. And we'd love to know, where are you watching us from? Comment below. Daniel's testimony marked a turning point. Not only did it corroborate the victim's accounts, but it also exposed the web of intimidation Ethan had woven to shield himself. The jury scribbled notes eagerly, while the audience barely contained their outrage. Despite this, Ethan continued to act as though the trial was nothing more than a temporary nuisance. His disdain for the judicial process and for the lives he had destroyed became more apparent with each passing day. The trial reached its climax, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The evidence against Ethan Grayson had piled up into an insurmountable mountain, yet his attitude remained defiant, almost insolent, as if he still believed his wealth and influence would save him. The day Angela Martinez took the stand, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. A hush fell over the room as she sat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her voice, shaky at first, quickly grew firm with determination. "I invested everything I had with Mr. Grayson," she began, looking directly at the jury. "My savings, the money my husband left for our children, everything. I believed the promises he made. I thought I was securing my family's future." She paused, and the spectators held their breath. Angela's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to crumble. "When I realized I had lost it all, it felt like the ground had vanished beneath my feet. My children and I ended up living in our car. They asked me why we couldn't go home, and I didn't know what to tell them." Ethan, seated in his usual spot, toyed with a pen. He barely looked up as Angela spoke. His indifference didn't go unnoticed, further fueling the outrage in the room. "Mr. Grayson," the prosecutor interrupted, pointing an accusing finger at him. "Do you think it's appropriate to ignore one of your victims as she describes the devastating impact of your actions?" Ethan finally looked up, his smile resembling a smirk. "I'm here to defend myself, not to listen to sob stories." A wave of incredulity swept through the courtroom. Judge Lee struck her gavel forcefully. "Order in the court! Mr. Grayson, this is your final warning. You will show respect, or you will face additional consequences." For the first time, Ethan's confidence seemed to waver, if only for a moment. He leaned back in his chair, but the assurance he once exuded was noticeably diminished. Angela's testimony was followed by a series of equally heartbreaking accounts. Parents who had lost their homes, retirees now relying on charity, young people who had abandoned their education due to lack of resources. Each story added weight to the mountain of evidence, and each word dragged Ethan further into public contempt. The most damning moment came when the prosecution presented a video from a private party at one of Ethan's mansions. Recorded during the same period, his victims were losing everything. In the video, Ethan toasted with a group of guests, laughing as he said, "It's amazing how easy it is to convince people to invest. All you need is a good suit and a great smile." The video played in silence, and the shame in the room was almost tangible. Angela closed her eyes, unable to watch, while Peter Vaughn muttered a curse under his breath. The jury watched Ethan, whose attempts to justify his behavior grew increasingly feeble. In the trial's final phase, the prosecutor addressed the jury with piercing words. "Mr. Grayson didn't just steal money, he stole dreams, hopes, and futures. He has shown no remorse. Even now he believes he can escape this with a smile and an excuse. But you have the power to show that justice is not for sale." Ethan, in a last-ditch effort, played his final card. His lawyer painted a picture of a misunderstood businessman, a man trapped by circumstances. But his words carried little weight against the overwhelming reality. When the jury returned, the air was so thick it was hard to breathe. Judge Lee asked them to deliver their verdict, and the foreman, a middle-aged man with a somber expression, announced, "Guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Lee struck her gavel. "Order in the court." Then she turned directly to Ethan. "Mr. Grayson," she began firmly, "your disregard for the law, your arrogance, and your lack of empathy have not only harmed the people in this room, but also represent a threat to the fundamental values of our society. Today, this court ensures that you are not above justice." The silence was absolute as the judge continued. I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Furthermore, your assets will be liquidated to compensate the victims of your crimes. Ethan, who had maintained his composure throughout the trial, finally showed a crack in his armor. His face lost its color, and for the first time he seemed to grasp the magnitude of his downfall. The courtroom began to empty, but the emotions in the air remained palpable. Angela Martinez stayed in her seat, clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they weren't of sorrow. They were the relief she had been waiting for years to feel. Peter Vaughn stood beside her, staring straight ahead, as if still processing what had just happened. "We did it," Angela whispered, almost to herself. Peter nodded, but his voice was heavier as he replied, "Yes, but the damage is done. This won't bring back what we lost." Angela looked at him, her eyes reflecting the shared weight of their losses. "Maybe not," she said, "but at least we know someone like him won't do this again. Not to us, not to anyone." Outside, media cameras swarmed the courthouse steps, eager to capture the victims' reactions. When Angela emerged, she was surrounded by microphones and reporters. "How do you feel after the sentencing?" they asked. She took a deep breath before answering. "I feel relief," Angela said firmly. "But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone he hurt. This trial was a battle, and while we may never fully recover what we lost, today we know that justice can still prevail." In the weeks that followed, Ethan Grayson's story remained a recurring topic in the news. His downfall became a symbol of accountability, a reminder that even the richest and most powerful are not above the law. Talk shows debated the implications of the case, and social media buzzed with praise for Judge Lee's decision. For the victims, however, life went on. Angela and her children began receiving some of the court-ordered restitution. While money couldn't erase the trauma, it allowed them to move into a small apartment and start anew. Angela even managed to enroll her youngest daughter in a community program to continue her education. One afternoon, as they unpacked boxes in their new home, Angela's daughter, Sophia, found an old notebook filled with notes and dreams she had written before their family lost everything. She held it in her hands, her eyes shining with a mix of nostalgia and determination. "Mom," she said, approaching Angela, "I think it's time to start over, maybe even go back to school." Angela embraced her tightly, her voice trembling. "Yes, Sophia, it's time." Meanwhile, Judge Monica Lee reflected on the impact of her sentencing. From her office, she observed how the case had sparked important conversations across the country. She wasn't one to seek recognition, but she knew this trial was different. It had been more than just a fraud case. It was a reminder that justice should never fear power. Days after the trial, she opened a local newspaper and paused at a letter published in the opinion section. It was an open letter from Sophia Martinez. "Thank you, Judge Lee," it began. "Thank you for showing that people like us matter too. Your sentence didn't just bring us justice, it gave us hope." Monica Lee folded the newspaper and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Her work was not easy, and she knew the system still had many flaws. But cases like this reminded her why she had chosen her career. Time passed, and life moved on for everyone involved. The news stopped talking about Ethan Grayson, and he became just another name on the list of disgraced figures in high society. In prison, Ethan found that his money was no longer a shield. The arrogance that had sustained him for so long began to crumble, and for the first time in his life, he had to face the real consequences of his actions. For Angela, Peter, and the many other victims, justice did not bring a happy ending, but it provided closure. It was the first step on a long road to recovery. One afternoon, as Angela left work, she received an unexpected call. It was Peter. "Do you mind if I meet you at the park with some coffee?" he asked. Angela smiled, accepting the offer. When they met, they talked about their families, their small victories, and how each day seemed a little brighter. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. This story is not just about the downfall of an arrogant man or the resilience of his victims. It's a reminder of what can be achieved when people come together to demand justice. It shows us that justice doesn't always come easily, but when it does, it leaves an indelible mark on those who seek it. So ask yourself, what are you willing to do to fight injustice? How can you be part of the voice that demands accountability and fairness? Because in the end, justice isn't just an ideal, it's an action, a decision, a commitment. In the months following the trial, Ethan Grayson's name gradually faded from the headlines, but the scars he left remained. The affected communities continued to rebuild, not just financially, but also in their trust in the institutions that should have protected them. Yet a subtle but significant shift was felt. Angela Martinez became one of the most prominent voices among the victims. She used her experience to advocate for stronger consumer protection laws and participated in community forums to educate others on how to avoid financial fraud. She found that by sharing her story, she could give back to those who, like her, had felt the hopelessness of being betrayed. One afternoon, while speaking at a community event, she paused to look at the crowd. There were people of all ages, entire families listening intently. She took a deep breath and said, "Ethan Grayson thought he could take everything from us, even our dignity. But what he didn't understand is that our strength isn't in what we own, it's in who we are. Today, we're here rebuilding, and that's something he can never take away."